Okay. All right. Hey everyone, and welcome. So today is week 1, video 1. It's going to be Demystifying Neural Networks by me, Sanskar. So, ever wondered what goes on inside those magical neural networks that power so much of modern tech? Well, today we're going to pull back that curtain. We're going to look at what a neural network is and how it works. And we'll also touch on a really cool idea called the universal approximation theorem, which helps us understand why these networks are so powerful. So let's start with, what is the neural network? Well, despite the fancy name, a neural network is really just a piece of math. It's inspired by the brain, hence the neural and the network, but more on that later. But don't worry, we'll be diving into the complex, or we won't be diving into the complex neuroscience today. So think of it as a system built to recognize lots of patterns, just like our brains do. Our examples will be recognizing handwritten digits, such as numbers from 0 to 10, and kind of differentiate our human brain from neural networks. You're going to see how these actually work because, if you think about it, our brains can really tell the numbers differently from 0 to 10 easily because our brains are very advanced. They can effortlessly recognize it, even when it's a different font or it's sloppy, different sizes, whatever it is. So if I had to write a program to do the same thing, it should be a whole lot harder, right? Well, let's take a look. So the first thing to neural networks, something called the input layer. So let's imagine that we're teaching a neural network to recognize handwritten digits. The network starts with something called an input layer. In this example, we have a 28 by 28 pixel image, so that's 784 pixels. But in this instance, we're going to call these neurons. So think about it as 784 little neurons, which each hold a number. This number represents the grayscale value of a pixel, which ranges from 0 for black and 1 for white. So I think you're kind of seeing what we're getting at here. Think of each neuron lighting up when its activation is high. So basically, wherever that number has the line drawn on that pixel, 28 by 28 pixel, then the ones where are lit up, we know that that pixel is lit up, so the neurons corresponding to it will be lit up, and we're going to see what that actually means. So each input layer represents the image you feed into the network. Next, let's look at hidden layers. So this is where actually the magic happens, even though there's kind of a question mark right now. In this example, we're going to be using 2 hidden layers, each with 16 neurons. So why 2 layers and 16 neurons? That's a bit specific. Well, it's kind of an arbitrary choice. In practice, you can experiment with different layer numbers and sizes. It's just the point is, these layers are where the network starts to understand patterns. Much like when you do your math problems, if you see the same problem enough times, you're going to recognize how to solve it. So let's look at the next layer, the output layer. This is where we have 10 neurons, and actually each of these 10 neurons will represent a digit from 0 to 9. The same example we're using. The activation of these output neurons tells us how much the network thinks the input image corresponds to that digit. So the brightest neuron here will be the network's guess for the digit. The network takes the input image, processes it, and arrives at a conclusion for the image's digit. So based on all the other layers, the brightest neuron will be the network's guess. So how does it actually work? So we know that each layer will influence the next layer. That's kind of the reason why it's called a network, a neural network. Well, it comes down to weights and biases. So each connection between neurons has a weight associated with it, a number. Think of these weights as being organized into a grid. We'll use green to show positive weights and red for negative weights. So just know that's positive and negative, with the brightness representing the weight's magnitude. Each neuron in a layer computes a weighted sum of the activations from the previous layer. So each layer it goes down, we get a weighted sum, and that weighted sum is used for the next layer. So it goes from the first layer all the way down to the output layer. But that's not all. Then a bias is added on. This number, the bias, is another parameter that controls whether a neuron is activated. So that's it controls the outputs of the output neurons. So let's talk about the sigmoid function. So the sigmoid function is basically that weighted sum with that bias that's added. Those things are pumped through something called a sigmoid function. This function squishes that output between a number between 0 and 1, and it's kind of like a neuron being on or off. So each neuron essentially becomes a function taking the outputs of the previous layer and then spitting out a number between 0 and 1. And that's how we know. That's what this function is doing. So this entire network is just an incredibly complicated function with 13,000 weights and biases that need to be fine-tuned or learned. This is what we refer to when we talk about a network learning. So what is the hope for the hidden layers? So the intuition behind the layers. What's the big idea? When we recognize a digit, we place together components. So a loop, a line, etc. And the hope is that the hidden layers recognize subcomponents like edges. Then the next layer might recognize patterns like loops based on those edges. And then finally, the output layer would recognize digits based on the patterns. This is what we hope to happen, but whether that's what the network actually learns is a different story, right? So it determines on how you do it. All right, enough about neural networks. We're going to talk about the second part is the universal approximation theorem. So switch gears here. And basically, this theorem says that a neural network with a single hidden layer can approximate any continuous function to any degree of accuracy. Basically, in simple English terms, a neural network can be a function approximator. This means with the right settings, it could take an input and produce an output just like any mathematical function. So consider this complex curve in the background of this slide right here. We can approximate it with straight lines. The more lines we have, the better the approximation becomes. But how do we actually represent these lines without using a piecewise function? That's where the ReLU function comes into play. It's very simple. Its output is 0 for a negative input and just the input for any positive values. We can use this function to build any kind of line we want using some very simple transformations. So by adding and subtracting different, I'm going to call it ReLU functions, and transforming them, we can make those straight lines that approximate our complex curve. By choosing the correct slope and bias in a given ReLU, we can shift the line in any direction. Then we can stack up a bunch of these to approximate any kind of function. This may seem a bit complex, but this is actually exactly how the neural network is able to approximate these functions. So, in essence, a neural network is nothing more than a combination of mathematical functions. So, does it work all the time? Well, it's a little more complicated. The universal approximation theorem only works with a defined range of inputs. Outside that range, the neural network may not work so well. Also, it's important to have an activation function like ReLU. Without it, the network will be limited to learning linear functions, which aren't actually very useful in practice. And that's why they are so important to neural network learning. They help construct these piecewise linear functions. So in short, neural networks are complex functions that, though a bunch of interconnected neurons, can learn to recognize patterns and approximate other functions. It's pretty amazing, and this has only been an intro to this topic. There's a whole lot more to learn about neural networks that we haven't covered today, and that'll be for the next video. Thank you.